Have you ever had to do jury duty? Well, I did just recently, and I was surprised at how intimidating the court actually is. I'd never had to speak to a judge in front of people, but I found it actually quite difficult. So, we are reading through Acts, and in chapter 4, which is what we're looking at today, Peter and John go before basically the Supreme Court in Jerusalem. So, if you haven't read chapter 4 of Acts, I want to encourage you to pause the video, go and read that, and then come back, and there's a few things that I thought would be fun to talk about. So if you're still watching, I'm assuming that means that you've read chapter 4 of Acts. And so what we find in the first part of the chapter is that Peter and John are in the temple. Now in chapter 3, they healed a crippled man, and then in chapter 4, it begins with them in the temple preaching to the people who witnessed this miracle. And so you'll remember that what we said early on about Acts is that there's this pattern. There's this pattern where a miracle will happen and then a message is given. And so Peter and John are following that pattern, and they get into a bit of trouble with a group called the Temple Guard. Now the Temple Guard was basically a police force, and they were there to enforce the laws of the Sadducees. So that just sounds intimidating. So the Sadducees were the folks that were in charge of the temple, and they would hold sort of court when needed, but basically they were this ruling class that controlled the temple. And so that put them in a place of power and a place of wealth. And so they had this police force that they could use to back up their power and to back up their claims. And so there was an opposing group called the Pharisees that you've probably heard of. So the Sadducees controlled the temple, whereas the Pharisees controlled the local synagogues. The local synagogues you could compare to, say, your local church. They were places of worship in towns and cities outside of Jerusalem. And so the Pharisees, who controlled the synagogues, believed in the resurrection, but the Sadducees didn't. The Sadducees believed that there was no resurrection. They were much more secular, oddly, than the Pharisees. And so the Pharisees, though, didn't pose the Sadducees a whole lot of opposition, but Peter and John are in the temple, and they're teaching about resurrection, and they posed the Sadducees a real threat because they claimed to have proof. They claimed to have proof that the resurrection was real and that the people could experience it through the Messiah, Jesus Christ, is what Peter and John were teaching. And so the Sadducees sent their police force, the Temple Guard, to snatch up Peter and John, and they put them in jail for the night. Now the reason they did that is it was illegal for them to have a trial at night, and so they put them in jail for the night, planning to have the trial the next day. So they have the trial the next day, and Peter is extremely bold. I mean, like I said, court is so intimidating. I can't imagine Peter being able to say the things he says, but Acts tells us that the Spirit gave the apostles the ability to say what they needed to say. And so Peter is very straightforward, and he uses this little phrase. He says, "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." And I thought it'd be interesting to share what that comes from. So there was a story in their culture about the temple, the construction of the temple. So at the Temple Mount, it was considered to be holy ground, and so it was against the rules to carve and chisel stones at the Temple Mount. But the temple was to be made out of stone, and so what they had to do is they had to quarry and I can't think of the word, quarry and chisel the stones, not chisel, but shape the stones off-site and then bring them to the Temple Mount. Now you can imagine that could get confusing. So they have a pile of stones at the Temple Mount, and they should be marked and everything. But as they begin to build the temple, there's this one stone that keeps getting in the way. It's bigger than the others, and it's just this big cumbersome piece of rock, and so the builders push it out of the way because they can't figure out where it's supposed to go. And so they begin to lay out the other stones, and they get them laid out, and they realize, wait a minute, we're missing our cornerstone. And so the cornerstone was the stone that you lay in first, and it determined where your walls should go, and it determined where the foundation starts and all that. And so you need the cornerstone really before you start building. And so these builders began to lay out the building, and they realized that we are missing the cornerstone. And they begin to look around, and they realize that that stone that they had pushed out of the way, that one that they had rejected and even tripped over, that was the cornerstone. And so Peter is using this analogy, this story that they all would recognize and be familiar with, to describe how Jesus came about, how he was rejected by the people. He was even killed. He was pushed out of the way, and they tripped over him. But he has become extremely important to the faith. And so at this point, Peter is then, the trial continues, but that Peter and John are ultimately released, and they rejoice. So that's chapter 4. Tomorrow we're going to look at chapter 5. So I would encourage you to read that before then. And it's Saturday. It's lovely out here. The weather is actually nice. So I hope you enjoy your weekend. And I would encourage you to continue to think about how you could take action, how you could stand up for your faith in a place that can be difficult to stand. I'm guessing that probably nobody that's watching this video will be on trial for being a Christian. But if you are, please comment. We'd love to know about it. I encourage you to think about how you can take action in your faith this weekend. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.